All right, so welcome to episode 3 of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. I'm T.
And I'm B.
And so just before we get started, just wanted to note that we are now available on a number of podcast platforms, so you can download us from there if you want. And also we set up a Facebook group. So if you do a search for I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, you'll see a Facebook page and you can interact with each other or interact with us, which no one has done either of yet.
It's early days. That's fine. But we do encourage you to share with your friends when you do hear this. Anyone who might identify it or be interested, flick it onto them. You never know.
Yeah, cool. We've got 2 dogs with us who we are trying to settle. So if you hear them moaning and groaning, apologies in advance. But today we thought we were going to talk about end times, last days, end of the world. I thought a good title for this would be The End of the World as We Know It.
And we do love a bit of REM, both of us. So.
Yeah, indeed. Losing My Religion is, although it's not about religion apparently, is one of my favourite tracks. So
that is great.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about prophecy then. So I thought we'd start with you, B. Why don't you talk about where you were at before you came into church in terms of end times and prophecy and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, for me, prophecy was something that I really connected with. I used to love, I had this book called Unexplained Mysteries, and it had things like the Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, Bermuda Triangle, all those sort of things, but also a feature in that was prophecies, and obviously Nostradamus was probably the biggest one and the one that people would identify with. And for me, Nostradamus was frightening but exciting, because all these things that were happening in my life, not my life, but everybody's life in the 80s, was seen through this lens of what Nostradamus had predicted. A big thing was nuclear war and the end of the world, and it was just exhilarating but frightening, and it was one of those things I couldn't look away from. It was a bit of a train wreck for me, because it was something that I think the way that it was written, the way that it was interpreted, was something that I connected with, because it did speak quite directly. Well, the way it was written and interpreted spoke quite directly to me, and the fear that I was feeling at the time, because we did have all the Cold War stuff happening. We had, the real threat of nuclear war. I remember being obsessed for a while about building a bunker in the backyard. Not that I wanted to, but just hearing stories of people that were doing that all around the world. So for me, it was real, and it was a fear, but it was also something that really took my interest. Yeah,
it's funny. Excuse me. It's funny, isn't it, that the way that was sort of presented to us, on the one hand, created fear because it was saying this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. But
on the other hand, it made you sort of think, okay, but there's a bigger plan. There's something bigger than what we're experiencing. So there's, dare I say God, but at least something beyond us that's sort of in control, that's able to tell us this is what's happening. And
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it played into that teenage angst as well, Early to mid-80s is the time you're trying to work out your identity, trying to find your place in the world, and then this sort of stuff comes along. So, yeah.
And, society at large was very much caught up in the end times, or at least nuclear war. There was shows like the Americans had this thing called The Day After. The British made one called Threads, which was all about nuclear war and what it's going to be like, when it happens. And it's interesting because that actually pushed a lot of society, I think, to sort of go, we don't really want to do this, and sort of moved back away from it even.
Yeah.
People started pressuring the government, and, just the whole nuclear threat was huge. But, I talked in one of our earlier sessions about how I was involved in this group called the Revival Centres, which was a cult. I'm not going to harp on them for too long, but I will say that this was a big piece of their messaging, right, was nuclear war. And they'd quote the verses from Joel, the book of Joel, which was, there would be blood, fire, and pillars of smoke.
Yeah.
And so I remember talking, and they would put that up and say, look, this is basically painting a picture of nuclear devastation. They even go back, the Hebrew word there is palm tree of smoke. So it's like a huge palm tree. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, and he said, every bomb has a palm tree of smoke. It's like, it doesn't say it's a giant palm tree of smoke. It was interesting that my friend actually said that to me. But nevertheless, I bought right into it. And there was another one that the revival centers were big on. They were saying, the Bible foretells, mass transit in the end times. And I was like, it does. And then one day I actually looked it up and it said something about men will run to and fro about the earth.
Yeah.
I was like, hold on. It doesn't say planes, trains and automobiles.
No.
It just says men will run, basically says they'll be a bit frenetic even,
No,
So
I reckon the world's always been like that.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, people get anxious. So, you go back and you look at some of these verses, they're not really that clear, are they?
No. And I think, for me it resonates with the whole, in university psychology classes, we'd speak about the Barnum effect. There's a sucker born every minute. And it's very much about that generalised message that people can hook onto and apply it quite easily. And
like star signs.
Like star signs. Yeah, and look, if you believe that, that's fine, and that's what does it for you. But for me, it's so general that anybody could make it a truth and make something from it. So it's that sort of thing that I think they get people in with.
Yeah. And it's funny you talk about there's one born every minute. I saw an atheist website once that its tagline was there's one born again every minute.
That is great.
So coming back to the revival centers, the end times was a big part of their messaging. And I can remember sitting with the same guy that told me all about how I needed to speak in tongues and be born again and everything. He actually started showing me the same day when I was on this camp about how the Bible was predicting the end of the world. And like you, I'd sort of looked at Nostradamus and these other kind of sort of more generic, less Christian kind of prophecies, if that's even a term, generic prophecy. But yeah, looking at those, and I was already quite keen on that, And so coming back to hearing this was like, oh wow, and I think it tapped into the same thing again, which was that not only is this going to happen, which is scary, but God's in control.
Yeah.
And it's all going to be okay in the end, or at least will be okay, poor suckers who don't get born again.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny what you say about the less Christian prophets. I mean, people, like a big thing at the moment is futurists. And, they've always been around, but I've certainly gone and heard a couple of futurists speak. And I mean, if you looked at what they're saying, it's sort of like prophecy. It's a little bit speculative about what's going to happen, but they talk about what we're moving into in the future. So I don't think prophecy is necessarily a religious thing. There is definitely a big secular element to it. Yeah.
Well, it's funny too, though, because I was reading something just recently about how the Christian sort of church turned the Old Testament, what they call the Old Testament prophets or the Hebrew prophets, into forthtellers of Jesus and Jesus' return and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But actually their message was much broader than that. Their message was actually more a critique, and their message was about social justice and a lack of social justice in the in Israeli or Israelite society and all that kind of stuff. And so it's interesting that when the Jews look at this stuff, and even modern Jews look at this stuff, they don't look at it as end times.
Yeah.
They look at it more as this is a reflection on Israel then.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, just those different viewpoints. And again, it's that generalism, I think, in some sort of way. But, what was your, outside of the Revival Centre, was there other, I guess, end times type things that influenced you?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say, and this is why I always want to sort of bring the Revival Centre picture in, because when I get into the Assemblies of God, which are now called the Australian Christian Churches, and part of that sort of became, my dog's making lots of noises here, sorry about that, became Hillsong as well. And I don't know how much this is all part of Hillsong, right, the end time stuff, possibly. But I was primed and I was conditioned, and so I want to sort of make that point, because when you tell your story, having not gone through a cult before joining this group, you may have a different perspective, right? But definitely I was primed, and definitely I was told that the end times, we were living in the end times.
Yeah,
we're actually in them. We're in them then, and that Jesus' return was imminent.
Yes,
and you best be good.
Yes,
because if you're not good, and he comes back in the twinkling of an eye, in the flash of a lightning bolt or whatever, you could actually miss out on heaven.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a real fear. But I think, even though you were primed through a religious experience or a culture experience, I was primed through the Nostradamus stuff because I connected with it, and it was something that probably piqued my interest. I mean, I definitely was exposed to the whole end times, the fear driven by that, and I better get on board because these people knew what they were doing. They knew how to navigate the fact that we're in the end times, and they had a bit of a roadmap, and it was called the Book of Revelations. And I mean, again, that was, it's a point of contention, I think, even at that time, that there was a lot of different interpretations of Revelations, what it meant. Definitely in fundamentalism, it was taken very literally. So people were, expecting Jesus to come down on a cloud, and horses being ridden and all that sort of stuff. There's all this literal interpretation, and I didn't know what to do with that. I mean, Nostradamus was, again, people would extrapolate what they wanted from it, and I think the same thing was happening in the Christian space. I definitely didn't get into it in a way that I probably didn't even get into it as much as I did around Nostradamus, because I just didn't like the fear that it drove, but it was definitely a part of it, and it was something that caused me to get on board a bit more, because I just had to make sure that I had to hedge my bets, essentially.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And you talked, before we started recording, you talked about how there were people to whom this was everything.
Oh.
This was their defining thing of their Christianity. It had pushed them to convert.
Yeah.
And now that they are in, this was the message, even more than maybe sort of, death and resurrection of Jesus and all that, and forgiveness of sins. It was actually, their message was turn or burn, the end is nigh.
Yeah, 100%. And I remember one of the earlier, probably in the first 1 or 2 years of my Christian journey, there was a bunch of people that were going out, and they were so convinced that they were going out to the local train station and what they called witnessing to people. So it was a sense of urgency, telling them about Jesus and making sure that these people jumped on board, and their message was very much, we are in the end times. This thing that's around us right now could end at any minute, and if you don't have security, then you're going to hell. It's really, so there's a lot of fear driven, and that I went to that once and I just freaked out.
So they were like a group.
Yeah, it was a group. There's probably about a dozen of them.
Were they going to other churches, or were they in their own church?
No, they were in their own church, and they were in the church I was involved in at the time, and it was a very small group, and I guess they were supported by the church at large, but not supported so much to a point where everybody was going out. It was very much seen as these people were at the front line. They were in the trenches, making sure that people were saved. And it was, as I think I said in my conversion story, I was never really comfortable talking to people about my Christianity, about my journey, So for me, that was a whole new level of confrontation, and that was not something that I was comfortable with at all. But I also saw a very ungraceful message, which didn't sit well with me either. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Were there any names that you sort of associated with sort of end times? Sort of famous preachers or? Yeah,
I think there was probably the one that stands out was a guy called Barry Smith.
Yeah. He was a Kiwi, wasn't he?
I think he was, yeah. And he was always touring and speaking, and he'd be guest speaker at churches. He probably didn't really come to the fore for me until 3 or 4 years in. A lot of people talking about him and going, this guy, he's there, he's on the money, come and listen to him. So I did. I went with a couple of people to listen to him, and I didn't make it halfway through. I just thought it was.
You're such a rebel.
But I was offended by the way he spoke, and then some of it was just dumb. I remember him playing a minor chord on a keyboard that he had on the stage, and said, for you musicians out there, never play a minor chord like this because it will invoke the devil. And I just went, are you fucking serious? Yeah. And I couldn't stay. the people I was with couldn't believe that I didn't want to listen any further, but I disengaged. For me, that was a bit of a tipping point. I went, no.
I think that testifies to the fact that you had a lot more critical reasoning engaged than I did. You know, because I would go along to these things and I would swallow it pretty much holus bolus. I would just take the whole thing as it was. I can remember one day though, and it wasn't Barry Smith, it was one of his apprentices who was involved in the AOG in Australia, and I can't remember his name, but he claimed to have been the former drummer for Rose Tattoo.
Oh, okay.
Right, so and you know how it is. That's how it was. People would tell those stories.
Yeah.
But he got up one day and he was sharing some fact, and the person I was sitting next to said, "Look, who pushed that forward? It's leading evolutionist." And he said, "Isn't it interesting?" And the guy sitting next to me said, "Isn't it interesting? We'll listen to him when he says a fact that we want to know.
Yeah.
But when he talks about evolution, which is his specialty, we don't want to know it."
Yeah.
You know, so talk about pick and choose the facts, right?
Absolutely. Did you ever come across Barry Smith yourself, or?
I read his books, watched his videos.
Yeah,
I never actually saw him live.
Okay.
I can't say, I've seen Barry live. It's on my bucket list.
Touched his robe.
No, but he's gone now, I think. I think he's passed away.
Yeah.
But you know what's interesting about him was all his books were like, this is it. The titles were like, Final Notice.
Yeah.
But then the next one would be like P.S.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Or, I'm making this up, right? I can't tell you the names of the books, but it was very much like that. It was like Final Notice, Here It Comes. The next one will be like One More Thing, P.S. Quite true. It was like that. So he was constantly saying the imminence, the imminence, the imminence. It's about to happen. It's about to happen. Yeah. And then 2 or 3 years later, he's publishing another book.
Yeah.
And so having to adjust his story as well. And I think coming back to this revival centre thing, when I was in the revival centres, it was still the Cold War.
Yeah.
So Russia was a big part of this.
Yeah.
And communism and the fight between communism and capitalism and democracy, and all that kind of stuff was a huge part of this. But later on, with the fall of the Eastern Bloc and communism, it became less about that.
Yeah.
And this is before the whole sort of Muslim thing broke out, and I'm sure we can come back to that in a minute and talk about the fact that it must be all about Muslims now. But it was very much about an economic thing.
Yeah.
When I was in it in the Assemblies of God.
Yeah.
It was about getting a mark of the beast, cashless societies, one world order, this kind of thing. New world order.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? That's definitely the mark of the beast. Is definitely, that was probably one thing. I remember barcodes. Everyone was going, look, everything's got a barcode on it now. You're next.
Yeah.
And again, it was.
I knew a guy who had a barcode tattoo on his head.
Oh, really?
Wasn't a fundamentalist Christian or anything, but I just remember thinking, okay,
he's ahead of the game.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I thought. Well, that's not the mark of the beast, but that's what it'll be like, I guess.
Yeah.
But no, true story. He was a skinhead and he had a barcode on his
That
head.
is brilliant. But that was a real thing, and that was a huge. Actually, that it's probably one thing that was the main thing. Actually, when I think about it was the mark of the beast, the cashless society.
Because we all had ATM cards, and we were told this is the first step, right? We all get ATM cards. We'll stop using cash.
Yeah.
And then it moved on to chips. Oh no, marks on the hand, and so it was going to be a barcode. It's going to be a tattoo.
Yeah.
And this is all based on Revelation, where it talks about that people will get a mark from the beast. But then it sort of morphed in my sort of time toward the end of being a fundamentalist. It morphed into being chips, computer chips under the skin.
Yep.
In the hand or in the forehead, and that was going to actually be our...
Yeah, well, technology was there, microchipping your pets. So I'm sure that people were thinking our pets were possibly the first recruits in the end times.
Yeah. But you'd hear stories too, like, I don't know how true they were, but you'd hear stories that, in Sweden right now, they're running trials with this chip under the hands and,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, God, I think Sweden actually, was it something I heard recently, has become the first pretty much completely cashless society.
Okay.
So,
well, there it is. Sorry.
There it is. So, well done, Sweden.
Yeah, high five. Yeah, exactly. I remember talking to a friend of mine once. It was a girlfriend of mine at the time in the church, and she actually said to me, because her dad was a pastor and he would preach on the end times, and she said, "Oh, my dad actually said that there's going to be the mark of the beast, but there's going to be other marks as well." I don't know where he got this from, right? But that was just confusing, because she was like, "And you can get those marks. You just can't get the mark of the beast." And I know that they probably just didn't want to lose their ability to spend.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Oh, yeah, you know, and so they were sort of making loopholes for themselves.
Yeah. You know? And if you're really literal, you just couldn't name your child Mark, just in case, could you?
The mark of the beast, right. Yeah, indeed. So it's interesting, though, that the stories were revised all the time.
Yes.
You know, like I was saying before, at first it was, you know, a tattoo of a barcode, and then it became a chip. And now where we are is, you know, like you and I are not in this anymore, but I mentioned that there was the whole Muslim thing, right? So they must be talking, and maybe you're more in touch, but they must be talking about, you know, that Armageddon must now involve Muslims. It'd have to, right?
Oh, you'd imagine. I mean, I haven't heard anything directly for quite a long time, but certainly I have heard people talking about the reality of the uprising of the Muslims, and it'll be a Muslims versus Christians war that will be definitely the end of the world, sort of thing.
And what were you saying? You heard something about the COVID injection being putting chips into us, or macro, micro, nano,
little something. Nano,
right.
It's a huge thing, and you know, I'm still in touch with quite a few people from the evangelical scene, and I've seen a lot of concerning posts from them on social media around their concern about the COVID vaccine being very, very much linked to Bill Gates' ability to nanochip us all and be controlled by 5G reception. You know, it's that level of paranoia that is just driven there, and they're looking to anchor their truth in something. And, you know, I think a lot of evangelicals, a lot of Christians, they need an enemy. A lot of the time that they don't. It's and I think something about.
And that's not just Christians. That's the world. Right?
It is the
you
world.
Need an enemy. I mean, that's what George Orwell said in 1984. You know, we needed to have the other countries or the other blocks that we fight against. That's part of the.
Yeah. It's a good point, right? And I think though for evangelicals, I mean, it's definitely the Muslim world. I mean, I've seen some taunting from. People in the scene from back then who are still hardcore evangelicals, putting things on social media about how disgraceful it is wearing a hijab, and you know how under a shroud of darkness these people are. I know some beautiful Muslim people and that find the hijab very freeing, and you know, it's that sort of thing. I just get offended, and not that I get offended easy either, but just in that lack of grace, lack of love, you know, everything is seen as an us and them rather than extending grace. You know, if people are living by that grace, then they're certainly not showing it, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, it becomes the other.
Yeah.
Right? And they need the other because they've got that, I think it's what's called a dualistic, you know, interpretation of the Bible, a dualistic understanding of their own religion as well. There's us and them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like you said, they need an enemy. And you know, any form of social control needs an enemy. We need something to be protected from.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that they do shift this.
Yeah.
The thing that I find fascinating about, you know, that the COVID shot is going to be putting nanotechnology in is my kids, and I've got teenage kids now, and they get shots all the time from the government. So if the government wanted to give them nanoparticles in through a vaccine, they could have done it like 7-8 times already.
Yeah, that's
you know,
right.
why do we need this whole sort of COVID thing? You know, like it seems like an overreaction to try and get nanoparticles into us. They could feed us things. There's so many different ways. It just makes no logical sense.
No, you put something in water supplies. I mean, it's pretty simple, but I mean, the reality is it's just a whole new level of paranoia. The whole COVID situation has been twisted around by evangelical groups, by many groups, but evangelicals have certainly launched onto that, the whole COVID thing being a conspiracy, that it's about government controlling us, that it's about bringing in a one world order.
But you say it's about a whole new level of paranoia. I don't think it is. Yeah. I think it's the same. It's just that we're sitting on the other side going, this is fucked.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, I remember just after I came into the AOG, and I started going along to Keswick Scripture Union bookshop.
Oh, yes.
And there were books there about the vitamin conspiracy. I remember seeing that and thinking, so someone was publishing a book saying that there was some sort of conspiracy around vitamins. Yeah. And there was another one about cable TV.
Yeah,
and there was this whole conspiracy around cable TV because the fibre could be used as a camera. Yes. And all this kind of... So, we had... you and I guess, had missed that train because we came in later, but the remnant of it was still in the bookshops. And I remember thinking to myself, no one's telling me about this.
Yeah.
But that was part of the whole end times thing as well, was this control by the government. And
yeah, it's a good... Actually, a little flashback I just had was a guy called Tony Van Brown. I remember going to see him speak, and he had a whole series on Star Wars.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Star Wars and the New Age.
Right, yeah.
So, and I remember it being a tape set. And I remember I bought the tape set because I loved Star Wars and still love Star Wars. And for me, it was like, oh my God, this is a game changer. If this thing has been influencing me unconsciously, I've got to know about it. So for me, it was, it was an interesting thing. And, Tony has also... left, and he's definitely...
He's now an advocate for sexual identity and gay inclusivity and all that kind of stuff. I think he still works around the Christian scene, trying to get people to be more inclusive and accepting. And,
and
all
absolutely.
That. And funny enough, a gay friend of mine said, that's like, a black guy trying to recruit for white power. Yeah. That's what he actually said about it, which is quite funny. I think it's more of the same, B. I think that they're doing the same thing, it's just the characters are different.
Yeah, it's true, actually. There will always be something. And I mean, if you look back through history, I mean, they've been talking about the end times for nearly 2,000 years. So this isn't anything new. I think they're just using the technology platforms as a bit of a justification now and a bit of a reasoning around what's happening. So, look, it's an interesting time, that's for sure. But I think you're right. We can see it very differently from this side.
Mm. Yeah. Look, without opening this too much, because we're sort of nearly out of time, but the idea of the end times being imminent is actually in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right, in the New Testament, right? That, Jesus said, some standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom come. And he says it twice.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of scholars that basically say Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who said that the end times were in his lifetime. And, and you can read some of the stuff that Paul wrote and some of the other guys in the Bible, Bible writers, and it's pretty clear that they really did believe that the end times were imminent. Yeah. And so what happens for us is that we read this stuff now as modern people, and we think this is, because we're taught to read the Bible as it's speaking to you now, rather than it's actually a product of its context. And so we read that and we say, oh, it says it's coming soon. But this was part of my deconversion from all this. Is I can remember I was working in a service station. I was working as a youth pastor, and I was working at a service station as well. And I remember cleaning up one night, and I remember just thinking to myself, and I think I might have even prayed. It was just me and myself in the servo at the time. And I said, you say you're coming soon, but you said that 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've had arguments with Christians about this since, because this was, for me, this was actually the straw on the broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
This was the final nail in the coffin when I realised, actually, he's a no-show.
Yeah.
2,000 years ago, he said he was coming soon. And then his disciples started saying he was coming soon. And so every major, or not every major, but every Christian throughout history, pretty much, or every Christian group, has believed that they are in the end times.
Yep.
Because the seeds were sown then, at the very beginning.
Yeah, and everyone will find signs when you look around them. It's a sucker born every minute.
And there's a sucker born again every minute.
That's right. Yeah.
Anyway, okay, well that's good, man. I've appreciated the opportunity to chat with you about this.
It's been good. It's been good. And I'm sure that these sort of things will come up in future podcasts because, even like I had that little flashback about Tony Van Brown. Things will come up that you forget about. Not that you've suppressed it, but you just forget about it because I'm getting old.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll see you next week, eh?
Sounds good.